This is a story that nobody wanted to touch, but the Capitol Police enabled the January 6th Klan attack, and it's a story that no one wants to touch. But was it cowardice, blindness, white privilege, or something worse? And when it came to the House, the January 6th committee didn't want to know. The news media's continuing failure to explore why the U.S. Capitol was so scantily defended against an angry horde of white Trump sycophants on January 6th of 2021 has now been compounded by the House Select Committee's refusal to connect the most obvious dots or ask the most vital question. Now, it is true that there were countless law enforcement failures that day, and indeed far too many for it to be a coincidence. But the single point of failure, and the one thing that could have prevented all of it from happening, was that Capitol Police leaders brushed off ample warnings that an armed mob was headed their way. They lied to everyone about their level of preparedness beforehand, and then they sent a less than full contingent of hapless, unarmed officers out to defend a perimeter defined by bike racks without less than lethal weaponry and without a semblance of a plan. Now, even the Klan insurrectionists who actively intended to stop the vote could never have expected that breaching the Capitol would be so fucking easy. Now, exploring why the Capitol Police leaders chose not to prepare for a combat, despite mounds of intelligence pointing directly toward such a scenario, should have been a key goal of the January 6th committee. Now, the Capitol Police leaders, like so many others in law enforcement, were unable to imagine the white Trump sycophants as a clear and present danger remains one of the most tragically under-addressed elements of that day's legacy, leaving crucially important lessons entirely unlearned. Now, the committee was instead focused on one thing and one thing only, Donald Trump himself, and to that end, its reports actively made excuses for law enforcement leaders, calling their failures essentially irrelevant, and the best defense the report concluded should another squatter ever incite an attack on his own government would not come from law enforcement, but from an informed and active citizenry. And what fucking hooey. Yes, Trump was the instigator, but going forward, the law enforcement community's blindness to the threat of white nationalism as more of an immediate danger. Now, learning the lessons of January 6th requires understanding, and when it comes to the role of racism, both conscious or either if you're looking at it consciously or unconsciously, in law enforcement, it requires understanding whether an individual law enforcement leader flinched for political reasons, and it requires an adjustment in the law enforcement community's skewed perception of the danger from white nationalists as compared to people of color. The committee members and investigators, however, didn't ask witnesses anything remotely along those lines. But the then Capitol Police Chief Stephen Son was the single person most responsible for the failure to protect that Capitol. But no one even asked him or anyone else to address how and why the lackadaisical preparations for January 6th compared to the over-enthusiastic deployments for the Black Lives Matter protests that never posed any danger to the Capitol, and they weren't even on the grounds that day. No, nobody asked any law enforcement officials if they viewed the January 6th Klan insurrectionists sympathetically or if they were under political pressure not to upset Trump or if they feared for their jobs. And certainly, nobody asked Sund or anybody else to consider whether the white privilege they shared with the January 6th mob had made it seem unthreatening to them. Now it's no secret why none of these issues were brought up. The committee Vice Chair Liz Cheney is why. As multiple committee staffers have told the Washington Post, Cheney's leadership on the committee came with strings attached. She insisted that the focus of the hearings and the committee's final report be exclusively on Trump rather than on any other lessons learned, especially those that might not reflect well on law enforcement at all. But when asked about the committee's plans in November, a month before the report was released, Cheney made her goals very clear at a University of Chicago event. There's one thing we will not do, and that is we will not blame the Capitol Police, she said. We will not blame law enforcement for Donald Trump's mob armed that he sent to the Capitol to stop the electoral vote count. And unlike the excellent media coverage of January 6th overall, reporting on the failure to protect the Capitol has been uniquely lacking every step of the way. I've literally been begging reporters since 1 week after the Klan insurrection to explore how it was allowed to happen to no avail. And on the contrary, press reports, particularly by the otherwise accomplished Washington Post reporter Carol Leonig, have repeatedly cast Sund as a martyr and a truth teller when he is neither. Now, the lack of any public exploration as to why these white Trump sycophants got as far as they did leaves us with a statement by Representative Cori Bush, who's a Democrat from Missouri. Only hours after the January 6th Klan attack is the most insightful analysis of the day's event. Had it been people who look like me, she said that very night, and had it been the same amount of people, but had they been black and brown, we wouldn't have made it up those steps. We would have been either shot or we would have been tear gassed. Now, now, with an examination of the committee reports, the accompanying depositions, and supporting documents, leads to the following conclusion. The failure was not due to a lack of intelligence, but there was plenty. I don't think it was a failure of intelligence at all, but I think it was a failure operationalize the intelligence. Basically, sorry. Julie Farnham, who's the assistant director of the Capitol Police Intelligence Unit, said, and she told the committee investigators they should have been ready for war, and they were not. The lag in the mobilization of the National Guard is a red herring. No one at the Capitol requested their presence until after police lines had been breached, and to the extent that it was discussed beforehand, it was in order to have the Guard help direct traffic on surrounding streets. Now, the Capitol Police were vastly unprepared. Despite Sun's insistence that he was getting all hands on deck, he didn't even cancel officers' days off. The perimeter was defined with bike racks, which are good only for protests where most people are law-abiding. They do nothing to stop a horde. In fact, they get turned into weapons to use against the police. The Capitol Police had no backup plan in case multiple protesters posed a threat. Even as police lines had already collapsed, clueless police leaders were trying to deploy more bike racks. Incredibly, Chief Sund ordered the removal of some bike racks late on January 5th for reasons that some of his colleagues considered suspect. Now, actual calls for help were only made after it was too late. The Justice Department officials said that even after they saw TV footage of insurrectionists parading through the Capitol Rotunda, the Capitol Police officers told them they had things under control, which they did not. Now, the police leadership simply could not conceive of white Trump sycophants as the enemy, but time and time again, law enforcement leaders were presented with intelligence showing that desperate Trump sycophants were targeting the Capitol, but they didn't take it seriously. Now, the anti-scale fencing, the kind erected around the White House during the Black Lives Matter protests, would have stopped any of this from happening, but it was never even considered. The most damning assessment of the Capitol Police is not in the committee's final report, but it's in the transcript of the deposition of Richard Donahue, who on January 6th was serving as acting Deputy Attorney General. Now, Donahue was no hero that day, nor on any other day during the Trump administration, but he was one of the few people not to mince words about what he saw. A committee investigator asked Donahue, what do you attribute as the single most or biggest failure of that day in terms of securing the Capitol, and why do you attribute that to, and what do you attribute that to, and what do you attribute that to? Now, Donahue replied with this: the Capitol Police failure to maintain the perimeter. I mean, there were certainly heroic acts by the Capitol Police that day, but I would never undercut basically what those individual officers did. But there was a complete failure of planning and leadership, and there's no reason. There was no reason that they should have gotten in that they should have gotten in that building. The Capitol Police had more than enough manpower, and they were the agency that was best equipped and best positioned to defend the Capitol. Everyone knew that the Capitol was at risk. Everyone knew that there were going to be thousands of angry protesters showing up at the Capitol, and certainly no one anticipated this type of breach. But you planned for the worst, and the Capitol Police should have planned for the worst, and they should have been prepared to defend that perimeter. And to this day, I'm completely shocked that they were unable to do so because they had the manpower to do that. And when they failed, and why they failed to do so, we don't fucking know. And again, that doesn't take away in any way, shape, or form from the heroic acts of those individual officers. But there's a leadership failure there, and it doesn't shift blame off the individuals who committed crimes to get into that building, but that's entirely on them. And that's a disgraceful criminal conduct. But they shouldn't have been able to hold that. They should have been able to hold that perimeter, and we don't know what the fuck happened. Now, Donahue had said that plenty of intelligence was widely shared among law enforcement agencies, and he added, you didn't need an intelligence report to know that thousands of angry people were going to be showing up at the Capitol that day who were upset about the election and who wanted to disrupt the congressional proceedings that day. And the Capitol Police should have been prepared to handle that. And I think they had the personnel. I think they had the intelligence, but I'm not for sure what went wrong there. Now, there is no analysis of the law enforcement failures that day in the main parts of the January 6th Committee's final report, but that was relegated to a short appendix intended to summarize the work of the Blue Team and one of the committee's 5 color-coded investigative teams titled Government Agency Preparation for and Response to January 6th. Its penultimate paragraph, sandwiched in between excuses, summarized the actual evidence that they collected. Now, federal and local law enforcement authorities were in possession of multiple streams of intelligence predicting the violence directed at the Capitol prior to January 6th. Although some of that intelligence was fragmentary, it should have been sufficient to warrant far more rigorous preparation for the security of the joint session. The failure to sufficiently share and act upon that intelligence jeopardize the lives of the police officers defending the Capitol and everyone in it, and emphasis added. Um, the most jaw-dropping proof that the Capitol Police was amply warned of was coming on the January 3rd, 2021 memo that we've known about since a few days after the Klan insurrection that came from the Capitol Police's own intelligence division, and it starkly concluded with this: due to the tense political environment following the 2020 election, the threat of disruptive actions or violence cannot be ruled out. Sycophants of the current squatter saw January 6, 2021 as the last opportunity to overturn the results of the presidential election. This sense of desperation and disappointment may lead to more of an incentive to become violent. Unlike previous post-election protests, the targets of the pro-Trump sycophants are not necessarily the counter-protesters as they were previously, but rather Congress itself as the target on January 6. As outlined above, there has been a worrisome call for protesters to come to these events armed, and there is the possibility that protesters may be inclined to become violent. Now, further, unlike the events of November 14, 2020 and December 12 of 2020, there are several more protesters scheduled on January 6, 2021, and the majority of them will be on Capitol grounds. The two protests expected to be the largest of the day: the Women for America First protest at the Ellipse, and the Stop the Steal and the Stop the Fake Steal protest. In areas 8 and 9 may draw thousands of participants, and both have been promoted by former squatter Donald Trump himself. Now, the Stop the Fake Steal protest in particular does not have a permit, but several high-profile speakers, including members of Congress, are expected to speak at that event. And this, combined with Stop the Steal's propensity to attract the white supremacist militia members and others who actively promote violence, may lead to a significantly dangerous situation for law enforcement and the general public alike. Now, the following day, Jack Donahue, the head of the Capitol Police Intelligence Unit, and his assistant director, Julie Farnham, briefed Capitol Police. Farnham told committee investigators how she ended her presentation. Farnham said, supporters see this as the last opportunity to overturn an election that wasn't stolen. There was a disappointment and desperation amongst the protesters, and this could be an incentive to become violent because they have nothing left to lose. The targets are not the counter-protesters, but the target is Congress. The protests are heavily publicized. The Stop the Fake Steal has a propensity for attracting white supremacist militia groups and groups alike, like the Proud Pricks. There are multiple social media posts saying that people are going to be coming armed, and it's potentially a very dangerous situation. A congressional investigator asked what the response was on that call, and Farnham replied, "I did not receive any questions." Now, the danger was obvious to anyone paying attention. Now, the media frenzy in the days after January 6 to find out who had not sent or seen which memos were ludicrous. There was no one memo needed. The facts were already in the evidence. The danger was obvious to anyone who wasn't willfully blind to the destructive potential of angry white election deniers. And the Capitol Police leadership kept on insisting that they had everything under control when they did not. Now, General Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told committee investigators about a number of intergovernmental calls involving the key federal agencies and the Pentagon, as well as the Capitol Police, culminating in on January 4th. Everyone knew, and we can't imagine anybody in those calls that didn't realize that on the 6th was going to be the certification of an intensely contested election, and there were large crowds coming into town, and they were coming into protest, and everybody knew that there was a probability, and more than a possibility, a probability of violence. Now, in fact, one official, then Deputy Defense Secretary David Norquist, saw precisely what was coming, Milley said. So during these calls, I only remember in hindsight because he was almost like a clairvoyant, and Norquist says during one of these calls, the greatest threat is a direct assault on the Capitol, and we'll never forget it. And why then did no one fucking act? The Capitol Police actually were very empathetic about how they could defend the Capitol, and Milley told investigators. The Capitol Police resisted scrutiny before January 6. Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser held a press conference on January 4th, and she told investigators, and she told the committee investigators on Monday, she had held her regular press briefing, and she invited the Capitol Police and the Metro Police, the MPD or the police, and the Park Service Police, and they all came. And then the Capitol Police person who was there to speak got pulled out of the press conference, and just that should have been like a trigger. Like these people, they don't want to answer questions about their preparation. We had like a little pre-meeting, and I asked them something like, where does your perimeter start? And they get up out of the room, call somebody, and the next thing we know, he can't participate in the press conference. So like that, it just kind of should have been a trigger that they just approached it differently. Now the D.C. Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency Director Christopher Rodriguez also couldn't get anywhere, we just had issues understanding and getting the full picture of U.S. Capitol Police's operational posture and what their planning was. This wasn't unusual, explaining that there had been a lot of challenges getting into operational and tactical plans from the U.S. Capitol Police for years. In a stark contrast to the Capitol Police, D.C.'s Police Department (MPD) canceled previously scheduled days off after a December 30th intelligence briefing, truly putting all hands on deck. The committee appendix states that the then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's Chief of Staff Terry McCullough spoke to Sund and was given a readout of the press briefing that Sund had given to another member of Congress. So we believed, and the Speaker believed, that the security professionals were in charge of the security and that they were prepared, and we were told that there was a plan. There was no plan, and at least there was not a plan B. The Capitol Police's plan, to the extent that there was even one, envisioned only scattered violence with maybe a handful of people trying to breach the perimeter, and there was no plan B. Robert Glover, head of the MPD's Special Operations Division, had told investigators what he saw when he arrived and just after the violence had begun. Now, on January 6th specifically, upon his arrival, he noted that there was very few uniforms in the United States Capitol Police that were visible on the grass area, and the West Front or around the two circles, the Peace and Grant Circle. He noticed that the officers that he encountered on his walk up toward the West Front seemed to be very hectic and scattered with no clear direction, and they weren't running toward the problem, and it almost seemed like they didn't really have an assignment at the point. And when he did get there on the West Front Plaza, the officers that were there were fighting for every inch on the line, and the pepper ball team that I saw above me seemed paralyzed. They weren't even being given good direction, but they had the capability, but they weren't using it, and we saw the deputy chief out there, and he but didn't see a whole lot of command and control. And then word got out that the police were abandoning the perimeter. The decision to pull back into the building was done in the blind and without consultation or understanding of the impact. There was no discussion about why they were pulling back in, and he had been told to come up to help, and it kind of became the MPD direction at that point. The committee investigators asked Sund to respond to the lack of the plan of any leadership, for that matter, citing the testimony of two deputy chiefs. One of the things that they told us was, in hindsight, they did not feel like there was a lot of internal coordination amongst all these moving parts, and that sort of people were sort of moving in different silos of excellence, and doing the best they can. There wasn't any sort of cross discussion or sort of unified plan going into the January 6th, and I was just wondering what your reaction was to that. Now, Sund said he found it a little disheartening that they feel that there wasn't a lot of discussions, and vaguely they blamed his deputies for letting them down. And the bike racks are a fucking joke. Bike racks are useful to signal to law-abiding citizens where they're not supposed to go. When someone jumps or pushes past a bike rack, that's an easy way to tell that they're trespassing. When it's a lone actor or two, police can then arrest them. But bike racks don't actually keep anybody out. It's considered just temporary perimeter security. Valerie Hasbury, the head of the security for the architect of the Capitol, had told committee investigators, "You use it to channel crowds. It's a demarcation on where they can go and where they can't, and everyone knows this. Yet bike racks were the Capitol Police's main line of defense. It's hard to explain just how over reliant the Capitol Police was on the bike racks. But consider this: at about 1:30 p.m. on January 6th, as police were under assault, the Capitol Police leadership asked Hasbury to send more. Now, in her deposition, Hasbury said a senior Capitol Police official, Robert Ford, called her to say, "We need you to get bike racks to the East Front, and they're being overrun." In fact, by that time, members of the mob were actually using the bike racks to attack police, and hearing this as a committee staffer was stunned, the following exchange ensued. It is fair to say, in addition to the fact that they could be used as weapons, I mean, what additional at the point that people were breaching the perimeter, and what would laying down additional bike racks do if they are not, obeying the limits of what the bike rack is meant to contain? Now, my personal opinion is that it would not have made a difference, and that is, again, and I did ask something similar when I got the request, because you could see on TV that the bike rack wasn't connected, and tried to put down additional bike rack in the middle of the mob. They just would have taken the bike rack probably off of the truck and started using it. Did Sund clear the path for insurrectionists? Now, the faith that Capitol Police had in bike racks makes one of Sund's last-minute decisions even more puzzling, and arguably even more suspicious. This is not even mentioned in the committee report, but on January 5th at 9:10 p.m., Hasbury reported getting the late request from Capitol Police to remove approximately 500 bike racks, along the First Street northeast and southeast, and along the south curb of Constitution Avenue between the North Barricade and First Street northeast. That's exactly where Ford the next day asked for them to be delivered in the middle of a melee. Hasbury said that she was told there was a concern about demonstrators being trapped into the two egg-shaped grassy areas just east of the Capitol, but she said that did not track with the past setups and didn't make sense from a security perspective. She explained. Now, my concern is, as noted, was again expecting this to be a larger event and potentially more violent event, and we're in essence not using the same setup and not that bike rack again as a security measure, but it was no different than what we would normally do. Now, Hasbury had suggested that there may be other factors driving that change, and namely Sun's desire not to appear to be responding more aggressively to these protests and to the Black Lives Matter protests over the summer. She explained. Now, it's been asked, and the investigators asked, was it ideological, and was there any political pressure? We're not aware of any political pressure, but again, my personal opinion is that it may have played a part in why there was a bike rack removed prior to January 6th. Now, the National Guard is a red herring. In the days and weeks after January 6th, Sun used the media, in particular the Washington Post, to deflect blame onto those who he said stymied his efforts to summon the National Guard. If we would have had the National Guard, we could have held them at bay longer until more officers from our partner agencies could arrive, and he told the Post 3 days after the Klan insurrection. Now, even 2 years later, Leonig reported without any pushback that Sun blames cascading government failures for allowing this brutal melee. And in the aftermath of the January 6th Klan attack, Sun struggled to make sense of the military's inaction that day, something he considered a dereliction of duty. The National Guard angle was all misdirection based on a lie. Neither Sun nor anyone else requested the Guard's presence until after the Capitol had been breached, and their presence shouldn't have been needed, and it might not have helped anyway. Sun did vaguely raised the idea of getting help from the D.C. National Guard on January 3rd in conversations with the House Sergeant-at-Arms Paul Irving and the Senate Sergeant-at-Arms Michael Stenger, who would have had to sign up on the request anyway, but according to the committee's reports, Sun told Irving and Stenger that the National Guard would be utilized in a similar fashion to the assistance provided to the D.C. police, namely staffing insurrections and for traffic control to free up the officers, although he acknowledged that the Capitol campus does not have many intersections in need of staffing. But okay, I'm gonna cut the video short on this anyway. But after more than 2 years, we still don't know and haven't really asked what toxic brew of retrograde thinking was responsible for this epic failure. So why should we believe it wouldn't happen again if it does happen again, for that matter? Now, but this is a story that nobody wanted to touch because why did the police fail in trying to keep these inbred Trump sycophants at bay? Basically, because Trump refused to call on the National Guard, and so did the Capitol Police. So basically, if you like the video, you can get the video, like, and subscribe to my channel, RBW King. You can also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out. And if you want to support my work even further, you can donate to my Patreon link, which you can find in the About section of YouTube. And for just a little as a few bucks a month, your donation can help go a long way. And thanks for listening.